Allow me to preface this video by being honest right from the start. The first Dark Souls is one of the best games I have ever played. I have a 3x3 of my favorite games, and it currently sits at the number 4 slot. I'm outlining my thoughts and feelings about each of the Soulsborne games. I'll point out what I think the strengths and weaknesses of each game are, but only strictly when comparing them to one another. And at the end, I'll give my personal preference and rank overall. This is just my opinion, and I don't think of anyone less who feels differently about which game they may or may not prefer. I will not be talking about Sekiro since I personally think it's far too different from the other Souls games. It doesn't have the RPG elements, the world building, the open world structure is very different. It only has some of the combat similarities. It is an excellent game though, and I fully recommend it. I just don't think it's close enough to the others to be counted as a Soulsborne game. Demon's Souls was my first experience with the Soulsborne series. My friend Javinja had a PS3 and I had a 360 back when we were both in college. He had gotten it for his PlayStation by word of mouth. I had bought my Xbox for the orange box and for Forza, and neither of us had a gaming PC at the time. So anyway, my friend Javinja bought Demon's Souls, and I was immediately entranced with it the first time I saw it. I went over to his house every day for about a solid week just to watch him play through it. He did let me try it out. I played through a couple of levels, played through it a bit, but I didn't do an entire playthrough on my own until actually after I'd gotten Dark Souls for the 360, and then I went back to Demon's Souls, and when I got a PS3 later, and was able to finally play through it on my own. Overall, I think the atmosphere of Demon's Souls is absolutely unmatched in the series and possibly all of gaming. Tower of Latria, Boletaria, the Shrine of Storms, these are some of my favorite areas in any video game ever, including the Soulsborne series. I think the art style of the world, the armor, and the characters that inhabit it are all the most cohesive and authentic. I also like the death mechanic overall. I like how in soul form you're ghostly looking and you're quieter, but you have the half health, which is a good penalty. But when you're in body form, you're louder and more noticeable by enemies, but you have that larger health pool. And I also like the overall shorter play time. I think it helps to the pacing of the game overall. I've replayed Demon's Souls about 5 times or now, I'd say, and I still think it holds up as one of the best in the series. I really don't have much negative criticism to say of Demon's Souls. I'd say its biggest crime is the fact that it's only available for the PS3. Hopefully one day this gets ported to other platforms. A PC release is unlikely, but I think that'd be the best way to experience and preserve the game. Here's to hoping. Oh, also, fuck World Tendency. That shit is benign and impossible to figure out without a guide. Whoever the fuck thought of that and implemented that was loony.
You have a heart of gold. Don't let them take it from you.
Dark Souls 1 was actually the first game in the Soulsborne series I played through in its entirety. I played through when it first came out, when it was brand new for the Xbox 360. I replayed it shortly after, as soon as the DLC came out on the Xbox. Since then, I've purely played it as the Prepare to Die edition on the PC. Dark Souls is what I would consider to be the best that the entire series has to offer. Even with its issues near the end of the game, I still think it stands tall as the best in the series. I love the animations, the armor, the weight, and the feel that just everything has. The lighting and the graphics are also my perfect mix of moodiness with clarity. They have a good balance. The bosses also feel the most intense and the most original in the whole series. The weapon animations, the weight of everything, it just feels good. It looks good. The art is both bleak and beautiful, and the soundtrack is the best in the series by far. I spent a lot of time with the PvP, and it has tons of balance issues, but it feels like it's the most authentic version of what the PvP was intended to be. It's not supposed to be a duel or a real PvP system. It's really just supposed to be an explosion of you run into this other player and you wonder who's better, whose build is better, who can make most effective use of the tools on them and the area that you're fighting in. It feels like it's intended. It's not this evenly matched duel. It's like a fight to the death among two people with different philosophies of combat.
Very good.
I also think the interconnected world and the learning of it through pure memorization is the greatest strength of the game, and I feel that every game kind of botches that compared to the original Dark Souls. The quiet sadness of the fantasy kingdom of Lordran experience its last dying breath just pulls me in more than any other video game world ever has. I like the story of the Lord Souls, the old gods clinging to power, the rise of humanity. I think this is the best implementation of this story in the series. I like Dark Souls 2 and 3, but I think their inclusion in the overall lore, and if you try and go back to Dark Souls 1 and explain some things using things from 2 and 3, I think that just kind of ruins it a little bit. So when viewing the story of Dark Souls 1, I tend to ignore the sequels. I think a mixed aspect of Dark Souls 1 is the Covenant system. They're for the most part interesting and a good inclusion, like the Forest Hunters or the Sunlight Warriors, but things like the Grave Lords not working as intended is kind of a letdown. And let's talk about the elephant in Lordran. Izalith is a huge letdown. The copy-pasted dragon butts, the poor level design that feels like there should have been more going on, and the horrendous boss at the end is just the worst. Also, shout out to the Painted World and Sen's Fortress. I think these are some of the best areas that the series has to offer, along with everything in Demon Souls like Balatari and Latria. I would say I replayed Dark Souls 1 probably about twice a year, if not more. I have hundreds of hours into it across the 360, PS3, and Switch versions and the PC version. I bought the Switch version just to have Dark Souls on the go. I did not buy the remaster for any platform, and I have no intention of. There's nothing changed in the remaster for the good. Nothing is added to the game I think is worthwhile.
We can overcome this together.
Dark Souls 2 is the weird little brother of the series. It's not made by the team who did Dark Souls 1 and Demons, and it shows. It has weak areas, weird level design, and it always just kind of feels off. Off in the way that the Souls series aren't supposed to feel off. The lighting engine is nice, and overall the art direction makes everything feel kind of bland. And while it runs at 60 frames a second smooth for the first time in the series, it just... The stick has dead zones and movement, and everything just feels overly stiff and sluggish. What I don't see many people talk about when they talk about Dark Souls 2 are the great NPCs. Yeah, some of them aren't great, but like Gavlin the Merchant and Chao Kwa the Cat are some of the best the series has to offer. I like their inclusions in this game even more than I like Solaire or Zigmire from the first one. There's also a great emphasis on build balance in Dark Souls 2. Hand-to-hand combat is finally viable for the first time. Magic is useful without just being straight overpowered. Pyromancy has a balance to it, unlike the first game where any character could just add Pyromancy to the build without any stat consequences. There was also a thriving PvP community for Dark Souls 2 on the PC for a very long time. It was consistently called out for its overall PvP balance. I'm not really into dueling in these games, so I never really cared, but I'm happy it's there for those who did. These things aside, I think Dark Souls 2 just has way too many faults compared to all the others. It has really poor level design and world design. It's bland. It retreads far too many concepts from the first Dark Souls while just being more shallow about them. Like, yeah, sure, we obtained 4 Lord Souls, but this time there's real no reason, just because the first one did it. The boss fights are also pretty boring. I think the Pursuer is the only interesting one in the entire game. The new ideas this game adds, like the war with the giants, is fairly interesting, but it's too vague. Like, the war started because they stole the Throne of Want, but it doesn't really give a whole lot of description in game of what that is or what it does or why we should care. The DLCs were also very good for Dark Souls 2, but felt like self-contained stories and didn't really fix what was wrong with the original narrative. I've played Dark Souls 2 a few times between the original and the Scholars of the Sin version, but I probably won't be replaying it again anytime soon. I just feel it has the least to offer in terms of uniqueness compared to the others in the series.
With Gavlan, you wheel, you deal.
I might get some flack for this. Maybe, who knows. But I don't really care for Dark Souls 3 as much as I think most people do. I agree that it's a lot better than 2, but it just doesn't have an original bone in its body. It feels like a best of Souls, which is not a bad thing, but there aren't that many games in the series at this point to really do a, remember this, guys? It feels like they were harkening back to 5 minutes ago. It feels like an overcorrection of the errors in Dark Souls 2. I'm also talking about it before Bloodborne because while it did come out after Bloodborne, I played it myself before I played Bloodborne, and I kind of want to get all the Souls games out of the way before I really get into Bloodborne, which is a bit different. Dark Souls 3 does feel amazing to play, It's faster and more fluid than the other games. The art, the graphics, and lighting are all fantastic and probably top notch for the series. The throwbacks in the game aren't nearly as bad as I made it sound like a moment ago. It still feels very Soulsy. The NPCs are great. I like the take on the Crestfallen Warrior, and I like the shop NPCs that show up. Only demons in Dark Souls really did anything meaningful with these NPCs besides them just showing up or having very small quests. So, a little bit of a letdown there. And Irithyll is definitely one of the best areas in this game. It's probably the sole contender past the first game for a best of area. The take on the prison and the swamp were just awful, though, and all the boss fights were pretty average. I like the Unnamed King and the Undead Legion fights a lot, but the rest were about as bad as Dark Souls 2 for me. I also very much dislike how armor and poise works. Armor in Dark Souls 3 gives you a sort of defensive percentage along with stats, so having an empty hand or head slot was never a choice of weight versus defense. It was always just better to have something in a slot, even if it was garbage. So it never felt right. In the earlier games, you might sacrifice a head slot so you can get your roll speed down, and that might be more worth it than the defense you get. It didn't really give you that choice in Dark Souls 3 because it was always better to have something. Also, what they did with poise was just garbage. In the past games, if you had enough poise, you might be able to take a hit while swinging without being interrupted. This made slow, heavy characters more tanky and could just tank your hit and keep on swinging, but a light character had dodge and time their strikes more precisely. To an extent, that's still present in 3, but it just feels wrong. Also, speaking of armor, Fashion Souls is in full swing here. There's even a menu option that lets you see what the character looks like in the armor as you scroll through it, rather than having to put on a piece of armor and then get out of the menu and take a look. Ugh, pure genius. Story-wise, I'm a bit mixed about Dark Souls 3. It felt like it was too much of a retread, just like 2, but it didn't try to do anything with it. It kind of tried to explain how the cycling of souls and linking the fire over time had diminishing returns, and this time the champions were like, fuck it. But we still did the same 4 lords that must be killed, get these 4 MacGuffins, bring them together. It was bullshit. The first one did it because it was original. The second one did it because Dark Souls 1 did it. The third one did it because Dark Souls 1 did it. I feel like if in Dark Souls 1 there were 5 or 6 MacGuffins, then in Dark Souls 2 and 3 there'd be 5 or 6 MacGuffins just because they did it too. It's garbage. Come on, guys. Better story, please. Overall, I think 3 is good, not great. I've replayed it the least out of any of the games in the series. Haven't played the DLC, probably won't.
Gives me conniptions.
This game is amazing and has the most cohesive and originality that the series has seen since Demons. And God, the atmosphere, it's so polished. It's H.P. Lovecraft inspired. This is just what the series needed after 2 and 3. The gameplay is fast, more about dodging and being aggressive rather than blocking and waiting. It completely changes the feeling of the game, the world, the combat, and how you approach everything. The art, the graphics, the music, it's all strong. The whole damn game gets Latria levels of atmosphere right from the get-go. The only thing about the feel of this game that sucks is being locked at 30 frames a second because of PS4 limitations. It felt okay in the first Dark Souls because of how much slower the game was, but here, with the emphasized speed and aggression, the 30 frames a second cap really feels out of place. The bosses are also pretty good. The first few feel great, but then overall they hardly change. It almost just kind of feels like they get very repetitive. Dark Souls 2 is all dudes in armor. Dark Souls 3 is monsters. Bloodborne is all beasts and monsters. The Shadow of Yharnam and Mikolash fights are my favorite in the series, or I'm sorry, the favorite in Bloodborne, just because they're just so different and you have to approach the fights differently. The others, it's just a big monster. Whack away, maybe dodge or heal, but mostly just whack away. The equipment in this game is a bit of a mixed bag for me. The limited armor and lack of variety in what they do with you is a huge letdown. The overall best set of armor in the game can be found right away in the beginning of the game, and aside from very minor equipment tweaks for maybe element resistance, there's no reason to ever change out of that armor set. The weapons are great, though. All of them have a second form they switch into when you press the L2 button. This makes every weapon feel very distinct and deliberate. Finding your preferred weapon is even harder in this game than the others because they're all just so fun, effective, and just feel good to use. The healing, on the other hand, is a bit of an issue. Demon Souls had this grass system where you'd have to farm or collect these herbs in order to heal up. And you just had to farm a bunch early in game and you could just load yourself up. Dark Souls did the healing system the best with its Estus system. It had that great balance I think I mentioned earlier. Dark Souls 2 fucked this up completely by limiting Estus in the beginning, making it so you had to collect more things to get more sips. So they added this healing gem system for the early game healing. The problem is Dark Souls 2 never got more difficult as the game progressed, so as you got more healing, it just got easier, and it didn't mean you couldn't use the gems, so you were just overpowered when it came to healing in Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 3 uses the Dark Souls 2 method of increasing the healing without the gems, and the game balance is better. It's tolerable, but Dark Souls 1 did it best. But when it comes to healing, fucking Bloodborne, forgive my AVGN moment, but what were they thinking? You can hold a max of 20 healing pouches and they don't recharge, so you're constantly just going out and farming. If you're really good or go through the first areas a lot for practice, then you'll have an abundance of them, but once you get better at the game, you'll actually have less because you won't be farming as often, then you'll have to stop and go back and farm them, and the loading times in this game are horrendous, so every time you have to stop and go back to do farming, it just feels like you're being punished. It's awful. The story, however, in its practicality and adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft is the most superb part, I think. It just feels like it's right out of one of his short stories. It's excellent to go along with the themes, and I think the pacing is very well implemented. My final thoughts for Bloodborne is that Yharnam might be the contender for best area in the series because it's so big and well designed. Played through Bloodborne 3, maybe 4 times now, and I'll definitely be revisiting this one in the future.
What are you still doing here? A hunter must hunt.
Overall, for the order in which I think they are from best to least best, because I don't want to say best to worst, is Dark Souls, Demon Souls, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and then just barely Dark Souls 2. I almost on certain days could swap Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 2, for which I think is the weakest in the series. I think each of them really does something that the others don't do in at least some small way, and I think they all deserve to be played. If someone asked me if they're going to play through them all, which ones are worth skipping, I would say none of them. You need to play all of them. But if someone were to ask me what order to play them in, I would just straight up say play them in the order they were released. Okay, that's all I got. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to me ramble. Hopefully I'll be making more videos in the future.